welcome to Jane, who's our last but by no means least presenter of the morning. Jane is a PhD student here at CRELLA, but like many of our PhD students, she works extremely hard juggling her studies for her PhD alongside a job at Cambridge Assessment. So Jane is studying the standard setting in panels for judgments of reading items in remote settings. And I believe Jane's going to present this morning some of the findings from her studies so far. So without further ado, over to you, Jane. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm just going to set up my...
Okay, that's good. We can see that you're sharing, Jane, and that's it. Lovely. We've got a perfect image of your first slide. Thank you very much.
Lovely. And is that still okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much for still being here. Today I'm going to be talking about my research project, which is investigating decision making and standard setting from the panellist perspective, as Nikki said. And I'll start with a quick overview of that context. Then I'm going to talk about a technique I'm using to analyse my qualitative data called framework analysis. And that is a codebook-based variant of thematic analysis. I'll explain why it's a good fit for my study and my research objectives. I'll show you some work in progress, and then I'll finish off with some general reflections on the method and how it's going for me. So just to put everybody on the same page, I'm going to explain a little bit about what standard setting is. As Nikki said, I work for a test provider, and test providers carry out standard setting for a range of reasons. To align to an external framework, to maintain standards over time, to set a pass mark, to establish different categories of performance, and to promote the reliability, quality, objectivity, the fairness of their tests. Standard setting seeks to identify the minimum level of competency required to perform a particular task or to use language at a particular level, as represented by a score on the exam or a grade on the exam. And this minimum competence is conceptualized as the minimally competent candidate, or the MCC. The claims that the test providers make about their exams, so what level or what aspect of language expertise or proficiency it measures, can only be as defensible or valid as the test itself, and as valid and reliable as the standard setting processes that those scores are based on. So the decision making of the content and domain experts who make up the standard setting panel is at the core of the standard setting process. Their conceptualization of this MCC and how they arrive at their judgments, what aspects they consider, all of these things impact their final decision. And in turn, that impacts the outcome of the standard setting and the eventual passing score for the test. So this is why decision making is so crucial to the success of the standard setting, and therefore a good target for the research. I'm carrying out a mixed method convergent exploratory study looking at what resources and factors panellists attend to when they're making their judgments about item difficulty on a reading test. I wanted to build on existing ideas in the literature about decision making, and so I looked at the standard setting literature within and beyond language testing, decision making in collective expert settings, and decision making in language testing, looking at raters and item writers. This enabled me to develop a model of decision making and identify themes and aspects for further investigation. I'm focusing today on the qualitative data I collected from 3 standard setting panels And this consisted of retrospective reports, small group discussions, and semi-structured interviews. Once I'd got the data, I needed to carry out detailed systematic textual analysis of the transcripts of the qualitative data, and a widely used technique for analysing such data across the contexts I explored in the literature review is thematic analysis. There are two basic approaches: a reliability or codebook approach, which is mainly deductive, or a more reflexive approach, which builds and develops themes as the coding process takes place. So because I was starting with a model, not from a clean slate, which is more the case in classic thematic analysis, I decided a codebook approach would be the best fit for my study, because I had themes and sub-themes based on my model of decision making and based on my knowledge of the standard setting context. The codebook approach I selected, and what I'm going to focus on the rest of the presentation, is framework analysis. Framework analysis is a codebook approach developed by Ritchie and Spencer back in the 90s, and there are some references on the slide for you. It consists of 5 stages. It starts with familiarization. That's reading and rereading the data, listening to the audio or video files, and that you do that to identify recurrent themes in the data. The second stage is to identify and design an initial thematic framework. So this approach met my needs because my codes are deductive, based on the literature, based on my knowledge of the context, and on my research questions. Other reliability approaches have a fixed set of codes, but within framework analysis, the codebook can be supplemented by themes or sub-themes identified inductively in the familiarization stage. I just point out that in addition to analysing qualitative data, this is a technique you can also apply to your literature review. So what I'm sharing here can be applied at that stage as well, if there are any CRELLA students out there and that's where you are in your studies right now. So for me, I was able to start with themes and sub-themes based on my model of decision making and my context. In the familiarization stage, I found support for these themes in the data and gradually refined my themes as I worked through the data. In the second stage, themes are sorted and grouped and organized in a hierarchy inside the framework. After that, indexing is carried out, and that's applying the thematic framework to the raw data. So that means selecting fragments and segments of the data and allocating them to a theme, a sub-theme, or a category. And this is basically coding the data. And this is an iterative process as the researcher becomes more familiar with the full data set. So as an example of this iterative process, one of my themes derived from the literature was the internal characteristics of the panellists, which you can see has 6 themes originally. So how they performed on the test, their internal conceptualization of the MCC, domain knowledge, their expertise as teachers and working in assessment, and their beliefs about assessment. But after immersing myself in the data, I found that there was a richness in the data around panellist beliefs, enough to make this a main theme on its own. And in addition to beliefs about assessment, I added beliefs about the MCC, the CFR, and language learning as sub-themes. So going back to my internal characteristics theme, I moved decision-making behaviour in there. Previously, that had been a standalone theme. I renamed and then expanded the domain knowledge into 2 sub-themes, one focusing on the passage and one on the item, and I expanded both of these with additional categories. And I renamed the other categories experience with students and ownability to better reflect the data. If you look at the blue chart again on the left, you'll see that the next stage in this process is indexing. So I'll show you what that looks like in practice. So the thematic framework is refined after the initial indexing because categories might need to be added, split, combined or deleted, as I just illustrated. This is an example showing 4 themes and sub-themes. It's just an example. In my data, I have 6 themes. In indexing, each sub-theme is allocated a column in the chart, and each row is a case or a respondent or a source. Themes can be numbered or not, depending on the preference of the researcher. I chose not to number mine because of all the numbering that's going to be in my thesis in terms of headings and stuff. I thought I would do my head in. At this stage in my analysis, I used MaxQDA software to facilitate the iterative coding of the data and organising my sub-themes and categories. And that's drawing on Brown and Clark's reflexive approach. This is an overview of how I'm applying framework analysis to my data. I've supported the indexing stage by taking a reflexive approach. I've built in iterative validation at an individual level as I go along, and a validation stage with peer coders. And I'm currently at the charting stage, which you can see under the blue there. The charting stage involves sorting the data into a thematic chart. So in other words, populating the chart with all the segments or fragments of the raw data, which is represented by the XXX in the slide. So if you imagine each cluster of XXX is a coded fragment. So working from the right, theme 1, 1.1, interview 1, you've got 3 segments. This stage can be supported by your qualitative software like MaxQDA or NVivo. The final mapping and interpretation stage involves summarizing the coded segments. So if you imagine where those coded segments are in the framework, in each box, you write a summary, and then it looks like this. So the neat little XXX represent the summaries of what was there before. Then you use the summaries to interpret the data, looking for patterns, looking for similarities, looking for gaps, and so on. So for example, theme 3, interview 1 and interview 3, there's evidence of theme 3, but not for interview 2. As I mentioned earlier, you could use this approach for literature review as well as for analysing qualitative data. And this interpretation stage is where you decide on your narrative for the data. You're not, I'm assuming you're not going to just describe everything that's in your data. You're going to pick out a narrative, something that is answering your research questions. So summaries can be used to develop a typology, and that's my plan for my data. In terms of my data and my final framework, I have a total of 6 themes, 26 main codes or sub-themes, and 23 subcodes. So looking at my themes on the right, for judges' beliefs, as I mentioned earlier, my sub-themes are beliefs about assessment, the MCC, the CFR, and language learning. I'm separating out straightforward and difficult decisions in my next theme. The next theme is actions that panelists took when they were unsure, and I have a few sub-themes for that. Personal characteristics such as decision-making behaviour, professional knowledge regarding the passage and the items, and there are many subcategories for those. The products of standard setting are difficulty values and the standard setting data that's provided to the panelists. Materials are the MCC description and the CFR descriptors that are provided to the panelists. Not all my main codes have subcodes, and it's mainly the personal characteristics which are divided into main codes and then additional subcodes. Here's a snapshot of my thematic framework for the theme of judges' beliefs, with the segments pasted in for one judge. So the top row shows the hierarchy of the framework with the sub-themes of assessment, internal MCC and CFR beliefs. These all came from my model of decision-making based on the literature. For assessment, I'm including 3 subcodes, And these are inductive based on the data. So reading subskills, item response behaviour, that means what the candidate has to do to get the question correct, and item quality. The next sub-theme, internal MCC, so their internal conceptualisation of the MCC, that has no subcodes and is based on my knowledge of the standard setting context. And you can see 2 subcodes for beliefs about the CFR. The CFR theme came from my knowledge of the context, but the subcodes were inductive. Learner profile is about typical learner abilities at a specific CFR level. So at B2, candidates should be able to do X. And language level is about beliefs about what lexis and grammar features are typical at a particular CFR level. Judges often say that particular word, for example, is B1 or A2, whatever. The segments are pasted in for one judge in the next row, as you can see. So not all of the segments for the text are visible, but I wanted to make it sort of legible and fit it on the slide. So you can't see all the text in this snapshot. Using a framework shows where the judge has coded segments and, interesting, where there are gaps. This data is from a retrospective verbal report talking about 5 items on a multi-item text. This judge identifies the reading skill of reading for gist and comments on the level of the vocabulary. They comment on whether the distractors work. They give their opinion on the MCC abilities, saying they should get the item right if they can get the gist. Now I'm showing a second row of the framework for a different judge and their retrospective report. If we start on the left, they both mention reading subskills, but they pick out different items. They're talking about different items here. One focuses on gist and one on scanning. Only one judge talks about item response behaviour for a specific item. They're both homing in on the issue of the distractors, and that's for the same item. They have different views on the MCC at B1 level. One judge brings up the language level of the text. What you can't see here is that they go on to say in detail why they think it's not a B1 level text. One of the decisions I've had to make at this charting, pasting in stage, is how much data to assign to a row. Given that I've got such a large data set, I've decided to allocate 3 rows to each judge per panel. I've got 3 panels. 1 row per interview, 1 row for focus group comments, and 1 row for the retrospective reports, even though they made 5 reports each, 1 for each item on this text. I'm not looking at whether they agree on an item, but on what aspects they focus on in general. So, for example, in the first column, I could summarise them both in a similar way. Judge 1 picks out the reading for gist subskill and relates this to whether the MCC will get the item correct. Judge 2 picks out the subskill being tested and why it is difficult for the MCC to arrive at the answer. And then in my interpretation stage, I'll be looking to see if identifying the subskill is a common process and what assumptions they make about the subskill, what else they talk about when they mention the subskill. I'll wrap up with some benefits I've found so far. I've been able to identify answers to my research questions. So one of my research questions is about what factors and resources judges use when they're making their decisions in a standard setting panel. And to answer my research questions, I need a list of factors, a list of resources, and a list of themes, and I've got that. I found evidence for my model of decision making in the data. I will be going back to it to refine the model based on what I found, but I have found lots of evidence for aspects of my model in the data. It has systemized my analysis, and it will feed into systematic reporting of the findings. It facilitates validation by the research participants. One stage that I'm going to go through with the participants who provided the data originally, once I've summarised everything, is to share their rows of data from the framework and ask them if that's a fair reflection of their decision-making process. So that's a validation stage I can build in. And the summaries will enable me to create a typology of decision-making. I'm not there yet, but those are the summarizing and the typology. Those are my next steps. And the final point, it integrates really well with qualitative analysis software like MaxQDA, and I'm assuming NVivo, and data management software. It works well with that too, like Excel, for example, for pasting into charts. So I'll just stop sharing now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jane. Wow. It sounds like you've done a lot of work there so far, and thank you for that presentation. I think that's going to be really interesting, particularly for any students among the audience who are also doing their own studies. And I was really interested, particularly in what you said about applying it to the literature review. That's something I hadn't thought about at all.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that's really got me thinking. In terms of looking at your data, it seems as though you're getting some really rich data there, with lots of different narratives going on within that data. And the question I wanted to ask you first of all was, in terms of how you bring that all together, because it sounds, if from what you've said, that there's no kind of quantitative aspect to it. So at no point are you, is that correct?
No, there is a quantitative aspect, and that's going to help me pick out my narrative, because I have all the data from all the quantitative data from the standard setting, and I've got survey data as well. But most of my quantitative data is from the standard setting. But what that will enable me to do is to pick out the most consistent and the least consistent judges in the panel. And so one of my research questions is about, is there a difference between the most consistent and the least consistent judges? So that will enable me, that research question will enable me to pick out a narrative there. And because it's exploratory, it might be that, no, there is no difference, or yes, there is. But that's okay. But that's going to be one of my, that will help me craft my narrative, answering that research question. And as you can see very easily from the slides, the gaps are just as interesting as the bits with text in, really. So there may be something else that screams out from the data once it's all in there. But my research question is looking at consistent and less consistent. And I should point out to any of the audience who are panelists, we do have a good group of panelists that we used in the standard setting, and so it's only I'm thinking I may not find that greater difference because it's only degrees of consistency, because we're using experts who are good at what they're doing. So yeah, it's the two extremes, the most consistent and the least. But yeah, everyone's within an acceptable range.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And just a quick, before I go on to some of the questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask you, it sounds as though that technique might be useful in terms of thinking about rater training and examiner training, because of the kind of richness of data and that you're getting. And in terms of, I was surprised to see that personal characteristics appeared so high, seemed to be so prominent.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a framework and a technique that can be applied to any kind of decision making and language testing, certainly. Yeah.
Okay. So, okay, sorry then, a question. How did you ensure coding reliability? it's often difficult with that type of data, and that's something that can be a struggle. So in terms of reliability.
Yep. So I work with 2 peer coders, and between them, they coded 10% of the data from the full data set. And we went through a series of coding and then meeting to discuss, comparing the coding, meeting to discuss, and refining some of the codes as well as part of that process until we had a 95% agreement on all the codes. Yeah.
Thank you. If something which awarding bodies will ask you, do you think your work will lead to a less resource heavy operational model for performing similar work in future?
Yes. One of the things that's already happened is that we've moved to doing standard setting online, and that's less resource heavy. But I think if I'm able to identify the most useful and the most widely used resources and things that we provide panelists, it might help us to fine-tune how much time is always the enemy of people running standard setting panels. So we need to identify how best to use the time that we have. So I think it may help us to identify how much time do we allocate to discussion, how much time do we allocate to looking at the CFR descriptors, and how important is the description of the minimally competent candidate, for example. So it's already feeding in to those things, because it's always there's always a tension of what do you spend your time on when you're running the panel. Yeah.
And are there any other applications that you think this technique will be particularly useful for within language assessment?
Well, as I said in the presentation, I think if anyone is doing a more formal type of study and they have a lit review section, they can use it for that. Any qualitative data that you're collecting can be put into a matrix, I think, this type. One of the advantages of the thematic analysis is that you have your framework with the original data, the coded data in it, and the summaries. So you don't lose the data, I think.
You don't lose the detail as you go through that process.
You don't lose the detail. Yeah, I think anything that involves decision making by experts. So as we said earlier, item writers, raters, markers, people in standard setting, anywhere where they have to make a decision based on their expertise.
Okay, excellent. Wonderful. Jane, thank you so much for being our final presenter of the morning. It's been a pleasure to showcase yet another fantastic PhD candidate who's working at CRELLA, and thank you for making the time. And I know what will be a really busy time for you. So thank you very much.
Welcome.